Good day there guys, welcome to our tutorial. In this video we're going to be looking at the basics of reactive forms. So at the moment I have a Angular app set up. It's just a basic app. I have a register form component, which is the only component. In this I just have some basic markup with a form. You can see nothing's been done over here, and on the UI side this is basically what it looks like. Just some basic input fields and then a register button over here. So first things first, we need to import the reactive forms module. So let's head over to our module and do that. There we go. So I'm going to be using the form builder service, which is basically just a service that Angular provides, which just makes creating reactive forms just a little simpler. So basically, instead of newing up form groups and form controls, we're basically going to be making use of the form builder service. So I'm just going to inject that service. Great. So now that that's there, we need to create a form. So we have our markup set up over here, but basically we need to now create a form group. So I'm going to create a form group, which is basically just gonna house the form controls that I'm going to create. So looking at the form, I'm creating a form group basically, which will contain various form controls, and that form controls will basically be these input elements. That form group will be able to basically maintain the state of the form as well. So you'll see it helps a lot in terms of creating a group for just managing the overall state of the form, the validity of the form. So yeah, let's get into it. So I'm just going to create a property, which is a form group, and with that I'm going to initialize that. So register form, and I'm going to be making use of the service, the group function. So the group function, which basically creates a form group, and within this group function it basically takes in the form controls. So our form control, which is first name, and you can pass through various values. So for the first value or first argument, that's basically going to be the initial value. You'll see later on we're going to add some validators as well, so you'll see that will be basically the second argument. So for now we're just going to basically have some 4 form controls, and they are not going to have any initial value for now. So last name and username, and lastly password. Great. Now that we have this, we have our form group set up on the class side. We now need to link this somehow in our form component. So in here we basically need to do some binding just so that we can link the form to the form group that we've created on the template class. So in this I'm basically just going to be using the form group. So this is basically a directive, and we're passing through the register form. So this basically is going to be linking the register form to the form on the mockup side. This is basically a directive. Yeah. So what I want to do is I want to add the submit hook as well. So I basically just want to demonstrate before we continue how the form looks in its current state, and then once we start binding, how it looks once we bind values. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to be adding a function which is going to get called when the form submits. So the form group directive over here, this basically listens for the default form submit, and then once this form submits, it actually emits a ng submit event, which is basically what we're going to be looking into. So once the ng submit event gets hit, I basically want this to call the onSubmit function on our side, which is going to be just going to basically display the values of the form. So what I'm going to do now is, so I basically, as I said, this emits a ng submit. ng submit basically once the form submits, and once that gets emitted, I basically want it to call this on submit, which is essentially our callback. So in the register form component, I have the on submit. This will not be returning anything, and I actually just want to get a snapshot of the current state of the form with value. So basically, I've just called the form, which is that form group that we've created, and I said dot value, which essentially just gets a snapshot of the current value of the form. So if we see this in action, we can see that once we click register, we can see the current state of the form, which has no values at the moment. So you'll see that once I type in test and click register, there's still no value coming through, even though we have linked it in terms of the form group and assigning it the register form. We actually now still have to import, or we have to link the inputs to the form controls that are in this form group. So just to demonstrate that, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically be adding a form control name. So this is basically what we're going to be adding to link the input to the actual form control name in the form group. So this is actually just going to be the name. So this links on name essentially. So over here, I'm just adding it to all of them because they will all require this. So in this case, the name is first name. In this case, it's last name. And in this case, it's username. And over here, it's password. So now, again on the UI side, once we actually submit this form, we'll see no difference initially. But what you will notice is that once I type in test over here and we click register, we'll see that now when we submit, the first name actually has the value of test, which is what the user has typed in. Another thing that I just wanted to show you as well is in the first name field over here, as I said, this is the initial value. So if I actually want to start things off with saying testing, and I head over to the UI, you'll see that initially once we hit this page, it starts off with testing, right? So next thing that I actually want to do is I want to create two getters. So getters is not special to Angular. It's basically just JavaScript. It's not specific to Angular in any way, but basically what it will do is just provide a nice way to, or a good way to access fields without going like doing a long way to access properties. So what I basically want to do is I want to create a getter for username and password. These I'll actually be using later in this tutorial, just in terms of validation. But what I want to show you is how this works in terms of displaying the value. So I'm basically just going to go ahead and say get and username, and this actually returns an abstract control by default, but we know that they are form controls. And over here I want to say this dot register form dot get. So I'm just going to repeat this for the password as well. Password. So this is basically just a standard getter. So essentially what happens is this creates a property on this class which is called username, and once you go ahead and try to query username, so if I go over here and I say this dot username, you'll see it looks like a normal property. So basically this username, once I call this dot username, it's actually gonna go ahead and execute this function. So it's literally just a neater way for me to do this instead of having this every time I want to say anytime I want to use username. That's basically all it is. And it's quite handy, especially when I'm going to be using this in the template. So instead of calling this, I can just use username itself. So all it is just a property which, once you call it, it's basically going to execute this this function, which is basically going to return this form control. So just to show you what this form control looks like, because we're also going to be looking at this username when it comes to validation. So let me show you what this form control actually looks like. So there's various properties on here, and let me show you what that looks like. So once you do that, I click register. So what you can see, we have a form control. You'll see that it has a status of valid. You can see there's errors, there's touched, there's a value. So you can see there's various properties. So the reason why I'm noting this is once we go further into the tutorial, I'm actually going to add validation to this, and using values like touched, the errors, using the status, things like that. That's basically what I'm going to be checking for on the template side. So let's get back to it. So next thing that I want to do is actually want to start with those validators. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take away this initial value. So let's go over to our form. So in our form, the first thing that I want to do is I want to say that this username and password are going to be the two that I'm going to make required. Let's say that in the scenario, the username can choose whether the user can choose whether they want to enter first name or last name. But let's say the username and password is required. So the first thing that I want to do is in the form, in the template class, I basically want to add a validator over here. So there's some built-in validators that you can use. In this video, we're not going to cover creating custom validators, but that's definitely something that you can do as well. In this case, I'm just going to add a validator which is required. So you can see I'm passing this through as the second argument over here, and same over here. So with username and password being required, once you head over to the form, at the moment you click register and nothing happens basically. But what I actually want to do is I actually want to stop the, let's say for this example, I want to disable the button if these fields are not filled in. So if I head over to the markup side, I'm just basically going to do some binding. So for disabled, I'm going to say if register form, so register form, which is our form group dot invalid. So this will basically be disabled when the register form is invalid. So again, this is nice with using the form group. Basically it has invalid or valid status as well, which basically tells you whether all the conditions or all the validation has passed in the specific form. So heading over here, we can see that if I head over to the UI, we can see initially our button is disabled, so we can't actually proceed further. And then once we start typing, you'll see that it becomes enabled again. Cool. So the next thing I actually want to do is I want to add a message for when the username or password validation should fail. So let's head over to the markup template. So under the username, I'm going to be making use of the ng container. I don't actually want a element to be inserted into the DOM for this check that I'm going to be doing. So I'm just going to go ng if, and over here I'm going to be using username. So this username is basically, so if you remember that getter that I created, so instead of going through the route of saying this, I can just say dot username, and you'll see I'm going to be using various checks for this, so it helps a lot in terms of not having this template code be rewritten. So first thing I'm going to check is if the username dot invalid. So if you recall from the log I did earlier, when we do test and we do something over there, when we log the form control, you'll see there's various properties, and I'm basically making use of those properties now. So heading back over here, actually in the submit, I'm just going to remove this and back in the control. So username dot invalid, so this will actually display as soon as we load the page, because initially the field is invalid. So I'm just going to add additional check, and that check is going to be the username dot touched or username dot dirty. So we can actually add a error message over here which will display for the scenario. However, I actually want to take it a step further and just add an error message specifically for the required validator, and then do the same for the password. But then for the password, I'm actually going to add another validator for min length, and then you'll see why I actually decided to go a step further in terms of checking the actual error message that gets thrown, or error that gets thrown. So let's have a look at this check over here. So we're checking if the username is invalid and if the username has been touched or the username is dirty. So this touched basically gets set once the user leaves the field, so on blur basically, and the username dirty basically will get set once he actually makes a change to the field. So I'm just going to add the error message, and then I'll go to the UI and we can actually check this out. So I'm going to add another engine container, so I want to do another check over here. So like I said, we can actually just add a message setup because we only have one validator on here. But just to take it a step further, I'm just going to say username dot errors and username dot errors, and we're looking for required. So again, this is basically just going through the errors property and checking for this required key. So this errors basically gets set when the field is invalid, and then we go and look for the required. So then we know, cool, whatever message we put in here will display for when the error is thrown for the required validation which failed. So I'm just going to add a span over here, and this is going to say the username requires a value, and actually I have a class set up for this, and a class is error message. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this for the password and just change the values. Cool. So once I head over to the UI, we can see that cool, we can't click yet, but once we click and click away, we can see the validation shows, and once I click away, validation shows. So this is again the touched. So because I've touched it and I moved away, now test. So again, this has been changed now, so you can see the validation passes, and then once I go back, you'll see it'll pop up once again. So now the next thing that I actually want to do is I want to add another validator for the password. So let's say in this scenario, we know that for passwords on our application, we need at least 8 characters. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to go ahead and add another validator, and this one is min length. So what you'll see now is password has two validators, one of required and one of min length. So going back to the form, what I'm going to do is now I'm going to copy this and then paste this, and then you'll see I'm going to change the required to be min length, and then I'm going to change this message to be requires at least 8 characters. So again, this is why I wanted to do the distinguish between which error message is shown. So when you have multiple error messages or validators, we can actually specifically add a message for the one that's invalid. So looking at the form over here, we can see test. You can see test. So even though we have some value in, we can see how min length is hitting and saying this password requires at least 8 characters, which again should now be valid once I add more than 8 characters. So that's essentially using the built-in validators. That is setting up a reactive form. We have some error messages displaying when the form is invalid. We have the submit button disabled when the form is invalid. We have our getters, we have a submit function, and that's pretty much what I want to cover in this video. Yeah, let me know. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you guys next time.